Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's 2023 Interconnection Process Enhancements Track 2 Working Group. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'm also joined on the line by our IPE Initiative team. Before we get started, just a reminder that the presentation for today is available out on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. Then you'll go to the Stay Informed tab. Under that tab, you'll see Policy Initiatives. If you click on that hyperlink, it'll take you out to our initiative landing page, and you'll be able to find the IPE 2023 initiative page there, and the presentation will be one of the very first activities on that page. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping reminders. Today's working group call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. So any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, but just a reminder to please keep those comments professional and respectful. And then we do have quite a loaded agenda today. So just a reminder to please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently today. We will be pausing for questions throughout the call today, so if you connected to audio through your computer or use that call me option, you can raise your hand using the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you dialed into the conference outside of WebEx, you'll need to press #2 and that will enter you into the question queue. Just a reminder for everyone, whether you dialed in or are on the WebEx, to please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question, just so we know who is speaking. And then if you need technical assistance at any point during the working group, you can send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer today is Michelle. And then you can also send your question through the chat to all panelists, and we'll keep an eye on those throughout the working group. So the agenda for today, in just a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Danielle for a few items, and then we're going to get into the stakeholder proposals. And then we might have some time for a quick break between all of the different presentations, and then we'll leave some time at the end to go over next steps and the initiative schedule. So this slide here just shows where we're at in the policy initiative stakeholder process. So we're here at the very beginning of proposal development, starting off with working groups. And these working groups will inform the development of a straw proposal. And the ISO will not request formal written comments between the working group meetings, but we will accept written comments after the final working group meeting, which will help inform the development of the straw proposal. And then the ISO will be taking notes and produce reports of each of the working group meetings. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Danielle Mills.
Isabella. So this is just a slide on the typical roles that we're following as a continuation of our working group process. I'm going to be facilitating today along with Joanne, who's also on the call and paying attention. We have Salim, who's going to be taking notes and producing the meeting report. We do have meeting reports from previous meetings as well, just for our own internal recollection and reference. Working group coordinator is Joanne on this, and then all of you and the ISO staff are working group participants. So we're really grateful for the time that you all have put together into this process to provide some ideas, provide new proposals, many of which we'll hear from today, and give input and vet some of those ideas as well, and that's going to continue. Next slide, please. So the goals for today's workshop, like the last workshop, we're going to be relatively quiet on the ISO side. Our plan is really to hear final stakeholder proposals from all of you. There are a couple of proposals related to problem statement 1 that we're going to start with today that were sort of carried over from last week. We also have quite a few proposals on problem statement 2, which is the queue management piece. So we'll go through all of those today, and then at the end of the session, we'll discuss next steps for working group meetings. There is one more working group meeting that we plan to have on August 1st, and then comments due August 7th, and how to move forward with the initiative beyond that. And of course, please note that we have limited time today, as we did on our last working group conversation. So we are hoping to get through as much of the substance of each of your proposals as we possibly can. So we're asking that you all, for those of you presenting today, please refrain from repeating proposals that you've already shared with the group. And also, you know, as commenters, I think it's great to make connections between some of the proposals that we've heard, but let's not use this as an opportunity to reiterate entire ideas. Though we do want to hear good comments and feedback from all of you. So thanks for all the work that you all have put into this so far, and we're looking forward to more good discussion today. Next slide, please. All right, so here's the agenda for today, or the presentation for proposals. We have 7, if I'm counting correctly. So we're gonna start with Savion and Shell. And then we'll take a brief break if we need one. We don't have one scheduled, but we can kind of assess how everyone is doing and if we need a break. And we're going to go right up to 3:50, and so we'll only have 10 minutes at the end of the session to talk through next steps. So we'll squeeze as much free time out of this as we possibly can. Hope to move quickly. Next slide, please. All right, and with that, we'll ask the Savion and Shell team to come forward and share their initial proposal.
Thanks, Danielle. And while we get those presenters promoted to panelists, looks like we have a question from Susan Schneider. Michelle, could you unmute Susan?
One more. I'm sorry, Susan. Go ahead. My apologies. Go ahead.
Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me? I think I was still muted until just this minute.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, I just, I don't know if you want to talk about this now or at the end, but I wanted to put in a plea for a little bit more time between, since you're having a workshop on the 1st of August, and to have comments due on all 4 workshops due 6 days later, which includes, I think, a weekend in there as well. Especially for those of us working with groups, that is a almost impossible deadline. And we really would appreciate at least another week to get those comments in.
Yeah, Susan, I appreciate that and understand that. It's worth kind of clarifying our thinking on the schedule. So we envision today as being sort of the final working group where stakeholders are presenting their proposals for the first time. The way we plan to use the workshop on August 1st is to sort of recap and synthesize all of the proposals that we've heard thus far in the initiative, to share a little bit of the ISO's thinking on it, and to hear feedback from all of you on some potential combinations of the various proposals or synthesis of the various proposals or modifications to them. But we don't anticipate having any new substance come out other than some of the sort of, like I said, modifications to what we've already heard on the 1st. So essentially, the way we thought about it was that today is the beginning of the comment period. We're posting the comment template either this afternoon or tomorrow morning for all of you, so that the 2-week period starts after this workshop for all of you to start thinking through your comments.
Well, the only problem with that is that, for example, the CAISO's initial positions on things is actually new information. It's not, and potential combinations of things are also new information. So everything you're talking about, while we may have the raw proposals today, the synthesis, the ISO positions, all of that is going to be new information on the 1st. And it would be good for us to have some time to actually absorb that and react to it, instead of, 3 business days or something like that to actually respond to all of that. So it really is a not a very reasonable deadline, even given what you've said.
Okay, we can take that back and talk through it internally. We are just working through a very compressed timeline still, and so the thinking was that we could provide you some direction on what to expect for the straw proposal, so that we could kind of revise it based on your real-time feedback. But I understand that it still sounds unreasonable to you, so we'll discuss internally and let you know.
Okay, we really very, very much appreciate that. Thank you.
There's another question from Jerry Melcher. Did you want to go ahead and take that before we jump into the presentation?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we
Go
can.
ahead.
Okay, go ahead. This is Jerry Melcher of the Public Advocate Office. I strongly support Susan's position. It's really quite a lot of material to review internally in an organization such as the Public Advocate Office, which does have a fairly extensive review process with management and upper management. And believe me, it's always been an issue with CAISO stating that they're a very transparent organization, but they really do give short. I think they're just really short with the stakeholders on trying to get important information to the CAISO to go through. So I think I'm not the only stakeholder that feels that the 20-day period is always what the commission, the Public Utility Commission, provides, and any kind of short period, whether it's 10 working days, is just never enough. So I appreciate Susan's position, and we support that strongly.
Thanks, Jerry.
All right, there are no other questions. So let's hand it over to Giselle, Matthew, and Ian.
Good morning, good afternoon. This is Ian White with Shell Energy, just confirming you all can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Joining us on the line is Giselle Ray and Matthew Picardi. Matt is my colleague here at Shell, and Giselle is the Director of Regulatory Affairs for Savion. Just Giselle and Matt, can we do just a quick mic check?
Giselle here.
Great. And we can get Matt on the fly. Next slide, please. So thanks. We really appreciate the opportunity to present on this and comment. I wanted to just give a brief overview. Today we are presenting as the Shell companies with respect to the CAISO. I think Shell Energy has been around quite a while in the West, but at least out west. A little bit less well known is our Shell New Energies division and our Savion, our onshore developer. And so we really have stakes in the ground in the trading and marketing space, load serving. Shell Energy serves retail load in California, et cetera. So we're kind of presenting today from a variety of viewpoints. Next slide, please. So we have, with respect to problem statement 1 and 2, some of the challenges and drawbacks with the status quo, I think, are relatively well known. It's easy for us to all identify the problem. I think it's less straightforward on what a possible ways forward are. And we would like to point out today a proposal that we outlined in comments before the FERC NOPR in our reply comments. And really what we are looking to do is create a rationing mechanism, if you will, to effectively ring fence the gate to ensure that sort of the best and most viable projects are the ones that are one, moving forward, but two, moving forward in the study process, and two, those projects are the ones that are utilizing staff's limited time and resources. So under the status quo, it's no secret that what we would say is sort of patience is the rationing mechanism, and we have a multi-pronged auction framework to present today. Sort of two potential auctions for the near term, two potential auctions more for the longer term, and then an exchange framework that I think really gets at the ISO's problem statement number 2, sort of the queue management piece. Next slide, please. So the first concept we have here is sort of the concept of queue gating, and we call this hosting capacity reservations. And the concept here is sort of an either or. We envision 2 different auctions that you could implement. They would both stack together nicely, and you could implement just one or the other if that was the need. The first would secure use an auction mechanism to secure an interconnection queue position. That would not explicitly involve hosting capacity, and we see this as a process that would be analogous to making a reservation sort of at a restaurant for a table for 4 at 6 p.m. The auction winner would secure the right to have their unique project studied, but that auction winner wouldn't prospectively reserve any actual interconnection capacity. That would happen sort of in the second auction. This first auction would retain, we believe it would retain and promote cost certainty of study deposits. And we believe it would promote the idea that developers would be willing to bid their willingness to pay and let the market solve accordingly. And this concept we have laid out, we sort of refer to as hosting capacity reservations, QP for queue position. The second auction concept mirrors sort of the current day CRR auctions. And what I mean by that is interconnection customers would bid for the rights to known interconnection capacity at known locations. These winning bidders would receive a specific, the specific amount of interconnection capacity at that given location. And we believe if this is paired with an exchange concept, which we'll go through in a couple slides, that this would be a great way of ring fencing the queue and making sure that the most economically viable projects move forward, given the scarce resource, which is interconnection itself, as well as staff time and resources. With respect to the auction proceeds, we envision the auction proceeds being non-refundable, where the interconnection customer would have the ability, when you pair this auction concept with the exchange mechanism we'll go through, they would have the ability to still sell their queue position if the project wasn't able to secure financing, or sort of there was some other issue with the project. So the importance of that is, let's say a developer wins the auction for our queue position, puts it in, and then has the ability to move forward with the hosting capacity. In the future, if that project didn't work out or was unviable for some reason, that entity would still have the ability to monetize and recover sort of those auction proceeds that they bid in order to enter the queue.
Ian, it's Matt. Would you mind if I offered an observation here?
Yes, please do.
Sorry, I had technical difficulty at the startup. This is Matt Picardi with Shell Energy, and I had our advocacy efforts around this space. And I I think it's important to understand that the concept on the exchange piece is also intended to really focus on the existing the people that are already in the queue right now. In other words, it's what we viewed as a no regrets way of managing the queue process. And the auction concept that Ian's describing right now is more something we hope to see implemented, you know, going forward on a go forward basis via the two concepts. And just for perspective, these concepts are intended to reside around existing rules. For example, you know, you would still, if California was using the first ready, first serve approach that FERC has recommended in the NOPR for interconnection queue, or already has it in place, this would work around that. These concepts would only come in when we are trying to when we see scarcity around queue positions, or demand for queue positions and scarcity for capacity. And so I think we just want to make sure people have that perspective as we describe it going forward. And one last footnote to it is, I don't know if the concept going forward, because it's probably partly the transmission planning process, it's to use the cluster process that California is using, that I think you've kind of put a pause on between 14 and 15 is my understanding. And this concept is intended to would work well with that concept of having clusters and identifying the pool of resources that want to attach at a particular point in time. So I just wanted to provide that perspective, Ian, as we go forward.
Yes, Matt, thank you very much. And we can move to the next slide. Great. So the first auction concept that I spoke to and Matt added some color was sort of with respect to prospectively for the near term. That is for the immediate future with respect to the queue and known interconnection capacity. We contend that you could also extend this concept for forward hosting capacity reservation auctions, sort of for future known capacity. And we outline that in the comments in our FERC NOPR reply comments, sort of the forward-looking HCR model, which would do two things. One would secure the right to interconnect to existing interconnections being freed up by retiring resources, and or would secure the right to enter the queue for new capacity created from the development and construction of new transmission projects or various upgrades. The auction proceeds here could fund grid upgrades, fund in whole or part new transmission selected in CAISO's TPP, and accordingly, interconnection customers would, with the highest bid, would receive the highest priority. That is the highest queue positions for future capacity. The benefits of auctioning queue positions in this way for future capacity, we think, are fairly numerous. Given we believe it would give better insight into future study costs that an interconnection customer would face, and also provide increased certainty for future transmission and construction costs. And similar with the sort of near-term hosting capacity reservation auction concept, being paired with the exchange proposal, we believe the exchange proposal especially would greatly enhance the liquidity of these near-term and forward hosting capacity reservation auctions. And again, that gives developers and interconnection customers the option to sort of get out of these positions via that bilateral exchange if they seek a project off ramp. Matt or Giselle, did you have anything to add here?
Not right now.
All right, great.
wait till the end. But thanks, Ian.
Yep. And then let's move to the next slide, please. One thing we certainly are cognizant of is the need for a sort of a transition mechanism or a glide path. And we envision a process by which the CAISO could implement a concept such as these auctions, and given the data for acceptance, begin processing interconnection requests, et cetera, under the new auction framework. Whereas for everybody else that's been in the queue for sometimes up many years, those entities, those customers would have the right to move along with their interconnection request under the rules which were in place at that time. That being said, we believe that a hard cutover is needed to some sort of new framework. And I think that this is an area where the exchange mechanism, which we'll talk about on the next slide, gives the ability for we would envision that being sort of optional for existing interconnection requests would have the ability to utilize that mechanism. And next slide, we'll get into that, what the bilateral exchange mechanism looks like. Okay, bilateral exchanges. Currently, queue positions are valuable and scarce resources. Right now, there is very limited information about queue entry. There's limited information about the requests that are in the queue, and we believe that begets more interconnection requests in and of itself. So that lack of transparency with respect to company, location, technology, really creates the incentive, creates the onus for companies to, find out as much information as possible. So put in multiple requests. And I think very key here to remember, and I just learned this recently, that the only way that I understand, the only way to acquire someone's queue position is through the lock, stock, and barrel acquisition of an entire project company. And we think that that's the key reform that could be made with respect to bilateral exchanges, is create a mechanism by which a company that has a request in the queue would have the ability to post on a public bulletin board basically what price they would be willing to sell their request, and some basic information about that request. Conversely, buyers could also sort of post on the bulletin board what they would be willing to pay at a specific location for interconnection capacity. We envision this is something that the CAISO could basically bolt on to the existing bulletin board. And we envision it being bilateral in nature, where CAISO would provide the venue, i.e. the bulletin board, that would provide the open access and transparency. But buyers and sellers would be able to come together to sort of bilaterally negotiate the ability for party A and party B to sell the interconnection queue position with or without selling the entire project company. And we think that this specifically would very much help with the existing queue and management of the existing queue. And ultimately, oh, Matt, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add that the idea, a little bit deeper was that as if this were to go forward, there would have to be like a window of time where if there would be enough information posted on the exchange so an interested party could access the other party that has the queue position, and they would have some type of period of time to negotiate, you know, a transaction to transfer the queue position, because they'd have to check on certain things like the compatibility technology and other characteristics to make sure the queue positions work for them.
Matt, we lost you there. But I think what Matt was getting at is that there.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying there would have to be an additional process embedded in this, or a period of time where two parties would get together and you could put it in the tariff or wherever they had 60 days to, you know, reach a final agreement on transfer. The idea is to use the board to put up enough transparency to stimulate, you know, two parties to get together, have a discussion that are interested in, a party that's interested in selling, a party that might be interested in buying a particular position.
Yeah, thanks for that. We have a little bit more on bilateral or on the exchange proposal on the next slide. Great, thank you. For interconnection requests in the queue, this increased transparency could enable these interconnection customers with unviable projects, but advantageous queue positions to monetize those queue positions. Conversely, for projects that are, you know, ready to go, very viable, very strong projects, but maybe, you know, don't have the best position in the queue, we see this as sort of threading that needle in terms of managing the inventory. The exchange proposal would effectively decouple queue positions from project companies and would provide added incentive. For those higher up in the queue, they may continue to sit and wait and move forward with the process, but they also would have the ability to utilize this mechanism that the CAISO could sort of provide the venue for if they so choose. And then this would require the CAISO accommodating the transfer of these queue positions. And I guess what we mean by that is the CAISO would host the information, host the basic amount of needed information on the bulletin board, but obviously leaving the commercial details amongst the parties. And ultimately, we see the exchange mechanism being an efficient mechanism for pairing viable projects with higher queue positions. Ultimately, that does not require the complete acquisition of a project company. And again, I think what's really important about this is it provides a mechanism for managing the current queue while respecting those queues that are or those requests that are in queue and have been for a various amount of time. Matt, did you want to add anything else here?
No, I'm good. I'm just ready for next steps, and just curious if Giselle wanted to add in a little bit on. We work closely with Savion, who's our wholly owned subsidiary, working on onshore renewable projects, and we work closely with them to work on these mechanisms to make sure that, at least from a developer's perspective, they had some merit. So Giselle wanted to weigh in.
Thank you, Matt. We just think that this would be an incredibly efficient and useful way to allow developers in the process to have the opportunity to advance or to step away from the queue. And any way that we can build in efficiencies, particularly in light of where we are today with the intensive amount of projects that are in these queues, is really where we're coming from, is We see this as a short-term, medium-term win for industry that would be very helpful. Whereas the auction mechanism that we discussed is something longer term that obviously would need some time to vet and to discuss with stakeholders. But any efficiencies that we can have right now in the near to long term are incredibly important, I think, to all the developers on the phone, because we are likely 5 years too late on a problem that continues to escalate. And even today, when looking at what could be the upcoming or will be the upcoming rule on Thursday at FERC, we definitely have our eye on looking at advanced mechanisms that go above and beyond that rule, which seem to be a bit of a baseline starting point and conversation. So definitely in favor of this short-term solution, and look forward to discussing further as well a longer-term auctioning solution.
Thanks, Giselle. Next slide, please. Just to wrap this up, again, Giselle put it so much more eloquently than I could have. We see the auction concept as something that again is more of a medium, longer term improvement upon the status quo. Obviously, what we've talked about today is sort of the hardly a blueprint, more of just a sketch, and there would be a lot of detail that would need to be filled in amongst with the CAISO and with various stakeholders accordingly. But I think, Giselle, yeah, you really got to the benefit of that exchange proposal. Is that's something that we can do right now, today, that begins to, as you said, yeah, sort of hopefully begin to bail ourselves out of the current situation we're in. Matt, did you want to add anything with respect to next steps?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And I just wanted to add that, so when we filed the comments, what we suggested to FERC was, if, at least with respect to the auction concept, they probably would need to hold a technical conference, because we introduced the concept in our reply comments, frankly, only because we didn't think about it until then. Another vehicle, though, it can get to FERC is if Cal ISO or any other ISO goes through a stakeholder process and proposes a rule and puts it in front of FERC, it could get there as well. So we're not necessarily limited by waiting for the FERC to take action, and this later this week, which I can say we'd be a little bit surprised if they adopted the auction concept simply because of the timing we had and when we introduced it into the process. But we look forward to, if there's interest in it, to developing it further with stakeholders and putting some of the meat around it that we feel we just didn't have time to put together, but tried to get it started as a blueprint. And as Giselle mentioned, in the short run, the exchange is something that we just thought, as no regrets, could be done pretty quickly. So that would be it. And we look forward to working with stakeholders on it if there's interest, and as well as what FERC is going to have to say later this week on interconnection rules.
Thanks for that, Matt. With that, I think we can take any questions if anyone has anything, if we're taking questions, and if not, that's totally understandable.
Yeah, we do have a hand raised from Rian Quadro.
Rian Quadro from Gridwell Consulting. Ian, I wanted to ask kind of a clarifying question, because I'm trying to understand how this sort of fits into not only the CAISO's current framework, but kind of the current norms of how developers enter the queue and how they conduct themselves. So right now, you're right. The only way to take control of an interconnection request / queue number, that's the same thing, is to acquire the whole commercial entity. But I would say the vast majority of interconnection requests are organized under an LLC framework that is only for that project, meaning, your queue position is all under Acme Q25 LLC. The CAISO allows for that to be assigned, meaning like I can sell that to you, you can sell that to Jim, whatever. You know, they basically confirm that everybody has a good credit rating, but other than that, those assignments really don't get rejected. So, and then the CAISO also happens to have a bulletin board for resource adequacy product, meaning that, you know, actual online generators who need someone to help them meet their contractual obligations. They have a bulletin board for folks to exchange information and potentially, you know, make up for each other's deficiencies with substitute capacity. And to my knowledge, that board isn't used at all. And so I guess I just wanted to point that out and then ask if I'm missing something in your proposal that the current assignment process doesn't cover. Like, are you thinking about just like the actual transfer of capacity? Like, what parts of the interconnection request would you want to be able to sell that's not kind of that whole kit?
Gotcha. Yeah. With respect to number two, I think that that's a good point. You know, I think every transmission provider, market operator has a bulletin board, but I'm not exactly sure how useful and how utilized they are currently. So that is a good point. I think that, you know, the bulletin board, you know, insert whatever concept there, whatever venue, whether that's, you know, in Oasis or we, you know, the where isn't as important to us as the what. And then with respect to number one, I think that's a good point. I wasn't aware that the CAISO allowed just a holding company, if you will, for just the interconnection. I guess what we're trying to get at here, what we're trying to solve is if the interconnection customer is sort of the project company along with its liabilities and, you know, obviously its Q asset as well. So I think that that's a good distinction. Giselle or Matt, did you want to take a whack at that?
Yeah, I was just going to say good observations. The one thing on the project companies that get the queues, that's correct. We've seen that in other places. The primary vehicle for the exchange concept was more to allow developers to publish a value that they would be willing to assign that for. So the idea was that if people knew what that value was, it's kind of creating a marketplace, a more transparent marketplace, and not only a value, but an interest. So that was the primary value. And also because a lot of these project companies are these LLCs, you don't necessarily know who's the owner of them. And so it allows parties to get together. Those were the fundamental kind of thoughts behind the concept. And it seems
Well,
to
I
be
will
fairly consistent.
say that when we went through the transparency item 2 years ago, I did support the idea of more transparency for legal entity, you know, being revealed on the cube list, but the majority of folks did not support that. So, you know, if you want to take the temperature again, I think that's a great idea. And I think, of course, the efficiency of bringing, you know, buyers and sellers together in a more transparent way is great. I think right now it's mostly word of mouth and brokerages out there that sort of get people together.
I think that's exactly what,
you know, the only reason I brought up the RA market, yeah,
No,
the only
you're right.
reason I brought up the RA market list was because I don't know, I think sometimes commercial entities might be concerned that they'll become a target for very precise queue management if they signal publicly that they want to sell.
Well, I think your observation that it's hard to identify the parties is partly what you're, but when you look at, I haven't looked at the California queue, but I looked at the queue and the way it's lined up in New York, and there's, you know, information there, but it's not helpful if you're trying to locate someone that might have a queue position you're interested
It's somewhat
in.
opaque, project's name to indicate who's a name.
I'm sorry?
So. Yeah. Oh, it's fine. No, I said you certainly can't look at a project's name and know necessarily who owns it, so I get that.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
thanks for what that looks like.
Looks like Rand's audio might have dropped off. Um,
Yeah,
let's
having
see.
trouble
I think the
hearing
last thing I
Rayanne.
heard,
I'm all
the last thing
finished.
I heard
It's
you,
fine.
oh, I was
Okay.
going to kid you and just say the last I heard was you agreed with us.
Thanks, Rayanne. So we are running a little bit behind in the agenda, so we have time for two more brief questions.
That looks like.
So let's go ahead and go to Fernando, and then we'll take Tony's question after that, and then we'll move on.
Hi, good afternoon. It's Fernando Cornejo with SC. Thank you for the presentation this afternoon. Just had some fundamental questions here in terms of, I think you mentioned that, this might be the most economically efficient alternative in terms of trying to assign or get the right sized interconnection queue. But I was wondering how you would factor in the additional cost in the development of these auctions and the subsequent, secondary market that may be created for these rights, and ultimately the presumably detrimental effect it would have on bids as it relates to contracts that may be issued or out there from load serving entities. It just seems like you have additional costs that are going to be later on top of the existing process. That's my primary question or concern. Then the second one is the possibility of having, creating this new market where you have entities potentially just hoarding that spot, that interconnection queue spot, without moving forward and holding it to see how much profit they can actually extract from a subsequent buyer. So it seems like to some extent, I almost would like to see a regret. You're saying it's a proposal with no regrets. I mean, if we're looking at revamping the CAISO's interconnection process in a dramatic way, and we want to really get the projects that seem to be most economically viable, the opportunity for them to subsequently resell a right that they had paid for gives them like an added buffer, an added cushion, and kind of reduces that risk, which to some degree would contravene, I think, the goal or the direction of the CAISO's not proposal, the concepts here. And so those are just my questions / observations that it seems to me that it's just another way to prolong the clogged interconnection request queuing, but just substituting players, and then furthermore reducing or minimizing some of that risk that the developer may take on the outset. And so to my point is that if they're really believing truly in their project and they believe it's viable, this no regrets option to me seems a little bit problematic, or that it would potentially contravene the intent of the discussion paper.
Matt, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think well, just two reactions quickly. One is certainly with any type of marketplace like this, you have to be concerned about behavior, and we did give some thought that maybe there would have to be a market monitor, or the existing market monitor would make sure that there aren't issues going on around the queue with this type of thing. But I guess where you sit right now, someone could already sit on a position in the queue and not, for a while anyway. So I'm not sure that the idea behind it was that it would encourage someone to come forward by showing their willingness to sell it and publish a price to move the queue forward. With expense, our thought was that on the, I think Ian mentioned it earlier, that projects that have good value behind them will be able to pay a certain price, and if not, they're going to be right where they are anyway in the queue. But it gives them an opportunity to move up if they have room in their financials to move forward and to build good projects. And that's different from the auction concept. Those are separate. They don't have to. And I just want to make sure you were just talking about the exchange versus an auction concept, because they don't have to all go together. You could just have the exchange concept go forward as a add-on to the existing system, and if it turned out like was mentioned earlier, the capacity, the bulletin board for capacity didn't get a lot of transaction activity, well, I guess people weren't interested. But it just seemed if you got a few transactions through it and it thinned out the queue, that would be beneficial.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. It just seems that there's going to be incremental cost to set up the auction mechanism, and then the actual bidding that would happen would seem to just ramp up the cost for the developers that will more than likely include those costs somehow into their bid for in response to an RFO. So I'll try to be quick here. I want to be sensitive to time. So that was one point. The other issue is I wasn't really clear. It wasn't clear to me, at least, on I think it was item 3, forward HCR auctions. I'm not sure how the benefit that will result in interconnection customers receiving greater costs for required transmission upgrades. Doesn't completely come through to me on how that's a potential a beneficial outcome of the auction mechanism. I mean, you're getting the opportunity to interest. I'm sorry.
Let me just make sure that we clearly stated the principle and go from there. The idea is that if you came in under one of these mechanisms and you were bidding through the auction process, again, not the exchange, you were bidding for either a position in the queue or capacity. If it turned out, and then you were applying those costs, the idea would be the proceeds from that would be applied to your cost to interconnect and towards system upgrades that would be required for your interconnection. After that, if you bid so much money that it was you were covering those costs, then the incremental money could go to things like reducing the system costs, any system upgrade costs for other customers, or it could go to some public policy cause that the state was interested in supporting. We weren't sure that bidding could get that high, but the thinking was that that money would go to help reduce the customer's interconnection costs. So it wasn't going to be lost money and drive up the costs the way you were thinking. Although in theory it could, but the mechanisms of having those auction proceeds go to pay for your interconnection, pay for your system upgrades, and then if there was money left over, go to these other things we thought would help address that issue.
In other words, kind of asking for more skin in the game earlier in the process to sort of gate the queue, if you will, with those auction funds obviously applied to, as Matt said, this cost of system upgrades, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I thank you. I get that clarification, at least on the initial acquisition of that quote property right to be able to have a position in the queue. But how about the subsequent sale of that initial acquisition? It just seems like I'm not sure how those benefits would carry on to a subsequent transaction. But I want to stop my questions. I'm mindful of time here. I know we got a lot to cover. I just want to, I guess, thank you for the opportunity to comment and state the observations here.
Oh, good questions. Thank you.
Okay, last question from Tony before we move on.
Northern California Power Agency. I'll try to be quick because I think I had a similar question as the gentleman from SCE asked, but the way we kind of generally look at it is one of the reasons the queues are so backed up is load serving entities ultimately are the ones driving procurement to meet various requirements, including regulatory requirements and such. But how do you factor in LSE preference? And I guess the question or the clarifying detail would be, does a project or a bidder have to demonstrate that they're actually going to build a project? I'm just trying to figure out how do you protect it against some type of market power where the entities that have the kind of most money effectively are looking to buy queues for the sole purpose of reselling them. So as part of the qualification process to even submit a bid in an auction, do you have to demonstrate that one, you have some relationship or commitment to a load serving entity, that the project is aligned with LSE preferences, and ultimately there's sufficient support to demonstrate that the project that's being proposed to be built will actually be built, as compared to just soliciting for queue positions for resale?
Yeah, I can take that. So good observation. Our proposal, the reason we had a difficulty being too specific is because we wanted to respect regional differences. And I think in California, as you mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, that a lot of these projects are driven by the load side. We were also coming at it from the perspective of other places where there's still some, what I would call project developers looking strictly at the market and whether or not there's value in developing a project based on things like a rec market and wholesale energy prices. But we're trying to make it work across all types of environments. So you might have unique rules to deal with the issues that you raise, where you do have to put in gating criteria to even participate, and that's something that we would expect to have to discuss for the auction concept. Yep.
No, thank you. I appreciate your feedback. And in the interest of time, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present today.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to LSA now, and I believe we have Susan Schneider on the line. Michelle, if Susan's not promoted to panelist, could we please promote her? All right, Susan, go ahead.
Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize I could unmute myself. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear
Can
you.
you guys hear me okay? Oh, okay. All right, good. Okay, I've got a couple of intro slides. I don't expect this will be a long presentation today because some of the things we just want to make sure we're in the right place. There was some confusion about our posted presentation last time, so we apologize for that. So I just want to be clear, this is the same as last time. We are not recommending an end-to-end solution. We're simply recommending some enhancements here that we think should be considered regardless of almost any other framework that might be chosen, with the possible exception of perhaps the auction, but even these can be also incorporated in that, and that these recommendations address both 1 and 2. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so the enhancements we have here, the ones in red, we were from the last workshop, so we're not going to talk about those today. But we do have a couple of process enhancements for interconnection procedures and the TPD allocation that we want to talk about today. We want to talk a little bit about, the 2021 IPE reforms to limit energy-only projects, time and queue, and just very, very briefly touch on the tax holiday idea. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, there were, and in terms of our process improvements, there were 2 that were addressing basically problem 1, and so we did talk about those last time in the first 2, so we won't talk about. We do have one of them is part of them, and these are managing the queue. One of them is expanding the list of changes that don't require MMA requests, and also increasing the MMA request timing certainty, which is a new proposal from us. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm not going to go over this in great detail because we did talk about time, but basically we're looking. We did provide the MMA, the BPM section that talks about modifications that are allowed without an MMA request, and we think the CAISO could broaden this list and therefore reduce the number of MMA requests it has. And we very much oppose restricting the timing of MMA requests because if projects need modifications that allow them to, for example, modify their equipment or their configuration, they need to have approvals for those very soon so they can move ahead with their project and don't have to wait for only certain times when those requests can be submitted. We also believe that the TPD patient transfers should be allowed, and the CAISO, who has just approved that, should at least see how that works before moving to change that. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, this is a new proposal from us. And we have many, there are parts of the process for MMA requests. There's the overall that have time limits on them and some that don't. The main timing limitations here are either 45 calendar days for which is the target for processing MMA requests, and 90 calendar days, an extra 45 days basically if there's some equipment modifications that need to be made. And we know that sometimes when projects are and that timing all starts when the project MMA request is validated. And we know that there are validation problems sometimes that do take a long time for developers to modify. So we don't want to push all the responsibility on the PTO here. However, when there is no timeline for once a request is submitted, doing the validation process initially, and then if there are problems that are identified in the validation process there, and then the developer does submit mitigation for that and to take care of those validation problems, there is no there's no timeline for when the response has to come from the PTOs. And sometimes we have, at least our members have had times where projects have languished for sometimes months before either the initial validation or sometimes when mitigation is submitted for violations when that validation mitigation is assessed. So we would like to see a timeline here. As with all of the times, like the 45 days, the 90 days, it would technically be subject to extension if for a particular reason or notification, but at least some assurance that there is a target at least for the initial and for subsequent validation reviews and responses. So usually in the NRI process, I think the normal response for submission of technical information is something like 10 business days. So we would like to see something in that time frame. And then some timely notice if there's some issues, particularly if the delays in processing here will impact their project milestones. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, again, we talked about this a little last time, so we're not going to talk about this very much here, but we believe that the CAISO already has the tools to basically limit, at least beyond the 7-year period, the time when the energy-only projects would have to leave the queue unless they can prove that they are viable. This is a form of viability proof that is already in the BPMs, and that requires the project to make sure that they are able to meet the new COD. And if there is some additional information the CAISO can provide about why this process, if it is being enforced, is not effective, then we can talk some more about what else needs to be done. But we would like to see this already existing viability demonstration enforced, and see what the results might be for that. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is our last one. Again, we talked about the last slide. We just want to make sure it's in the right category as a problem to submit here or issue. We do suppose the one-time withdrawal opportunity. There can be some conditions imposed if necessary, or PTO adverse effects. We can talk about that. And then, but we do feel that there is some loss of security deposits. But if a project lingers in the queue, there's no money there anyway. The project is just sitting there. And in the meantime, the project is triggering upgrades for other projects that are actually not going to be needed and imposing burdens on them, and potentially ratepayer funding of additional upgrades. So this would be a benefit that we believe at least would outweigh the idea that perhaps some security deposit forfeits might be given back for projects that have been in the queue for some time but are willing to leave. So that's it. That's the end of our our presentation, and I would be happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Are there any questions for Susan? Again, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen, or pressing #2 if you dialed in separately. Looks like we have a hand from Fernando.
Yeah, thanks. Fernando Cornejo with SE. Two topics here. First of all, we would support the proposal to have energy-only projects that are in the queue beyond 7 years, to find a way to remove those out of the queue. We would agree that there's existing provisions in the CAISO tariff that permits that. We would just like to see the implementation or enforcement of those provisions. The second point is with respect to tax holiday. We would be obviously very concerned with any kind of a tax holiday without addressing the potential financial risk shifting to the PTOs and having the PTOs absorb any type of additional losses or financial consequences on us. So while there's no details that I see now, that is a very problematic proposal, at least from SE's standpoint.
I think that we'd be willing to discuss that and to see how that could be addressed in this situation. But yeah, we do understand the concern. As it turns out, I mean, what would happen is if the project is lingering there, the PTO would have to go ahead and build whatever it was anyway, potentially for later Q projects. But we could, we're certainly open to discussing that and to see if there are ways to mitigate that. And also, but we do think it should be looked at as in the larger picture, which is the idea that additional upgrades are not going to be triggered or have less probability of being triggered if these projects will just get out of the way. So we'd like to not necessarily look at a narrow impact like that, but look at it in the context of the overall proposal.
Yeah, I mean, the interconnection customer benefits of such a proposal are pretty evident. I just want to make sure that they're balanced against the negative impacts on the PTO. So that definitely would need to be addressed. But I don't have much to say beyond that. I just want to make sure that the concern is voiced here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a valid concern, but of course, in terms of impacts on developers, once those upgrades are built, they are refundable. So the ratepayers end up paying for those anyway. So the PTO sort of equals ratepayers and equals, again, we think we don't want to downplay that concern. We just want to make sure the whole thing that it's looked at as a whole. Other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Okay, well, I thought I'm able to get you a couple minutes back, so we'll see how it goes.
All right. Thank you, Susan. All right, if we could move Kathleen Colbert to panelist, I will hand it over to you, Kathleen.
Kathleen, go ahead and unmute your line.
Hello, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vista. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. I'm on my phone. I'm having trouble hearing some folks. So if you are having trouble hearing me, please, Danielle, I'll look at you, or Isabella, say something. I can switch to my computer. Okay, but let me know. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the last time we were together, Vista presented two proposals that got at the problem statement 1 about the queue intake. Problem statement 2, which is about how do we better manage projects through the queue? How do we make sure that as projects are moving through the queue, that the queue stays right sized? So if we think of problem statement 1 as right sizing the intake, I think of problem statement 2 as how do we maintain that size appropriately as we move along, so that we continue to have the most viable and accurate projects. And when I talk about this particular concept, and I'm going to reemphasize, this is a concept, not a proposal like the ones that we gave before. As we have been getting towards this meeting, the prior meeting, we've been looking at the queue. We've been thinking about the troubles and frankly having some experiences that have caused concern that we want to bring forward and highlight. We were surprised this wasn't highlighted in the CAISO concept paper. And so we're hoping that through highlighting this trend, that the CAISO hopefully will take ownership and kind of think about a solution. I'm going to throw out some ideas and hopefully facilitate a conversation to get you started today. But that's really the intent of this, is to highlight the problem and then talk a little bit about it, get some stakeholder feedback, and hopefully in next steps, we can put some more meat on it. So to get started, here's what we've seen. There's a pattern of projects that are not meeting their scheduled dates and are not updating their online dates, whether it's their sync dates or their COD date within the interconnection. And this is something that has ripple effects. It impacts the accuracy of the models themselves and undermines the meaningfulness of the results, especially if the magnitude is large. And I'm showing some data to the right. This was pulled on July 6th in anticipation of the deck that we submitted. It is all the different study types, and I'm showing this to really highlight this is not a cluster problem so much as it is every single type of interconnection project. This problem exists. It is a systemic issue with the queue. I've also broken it out into energy only versus full capacity versus partial capacity or off-peak deliverability, the grand total of that being requested. I should have said these are the net megawatts to grid, my apologies. But this is the net megawatt to grid for that amount. And at this point, I will acknowledge that the total megawatt amount is not significant, but it's not meaningless. It's not de minimis. It's about 7,000 megawatts that, and I think I updated this again since June 21st. Apologies, I worked on the slides a couple times, so I can send corrections if needed. But about 7,000 megawatts. And we're concerned that this is going to get worse. So with the magnitude and the scale of cluster 14 and cluster 15, if we continue to manage a queue where this is a persistent systemic issue, that it will become so significant it undermines the meaningfulness of the studies. It also undermines incentives to project developers to make sure that they are on track and working towards their achievable dates. So I noted a couple adverse outcomes that we see. And even though this looks like it may not have an outsized impact, we believe, and just one second, Doug, we believe that it's possible, because we don't have this level of transparency, but like it's possible in very specific areas it could have a larger impact. I mentioned concerns with cluster 14 and 15. I just wanted to note, I think there are benefits of doing milestone update requirements. Correcting for inaccuracies in interconnection studies ensures more meaningful results. And it also mitigates work that I believe is occurring with conversions to the new resource implementation process prior to when a project really is moving into that the queue management team might not see, but the new resource implementation team may be impacted by. Let me stop. I saw Debbie raise her hand. Do you want to add something? I'm very open to, please, this is a conversation, not a presentation, I hope.
Yeah, just to let you know, what ends up happening is we're actually on top of all of this. The units that you see that have COD dates that have already passed are either twofold. One is the unit is getting ready to actually COD, or a part of the unit has already COD, but not all of the unit. You have to remember that the queue report only has the final COD date on it. So out of a 1,000 megawatt unit, you could have 900 megawatts online, and the COD date is not current in accordance with the report because it's not supposed to be finalized until December 31st of this year. The second thing is that a lot of the units that you see that have past CODs have material modifications in progress to push those dates out. So I'm not as concerned as you are with these statistics. Just to let you know, they are being worked on.
No, that's super helpful. I know Rayanne has brought up this would be helpful for transparency and data, and ask the CAISO kind of show which of the projects that are in the queue have come online, a portion of them, but this is their final date. So I am aware that these are the final dates. It's great to socialize that across the group. I know we've brought that up in the prior meetings, asking for that level of detail and transparency. I'll just do another plug for that. And it's also good to know that some have MMAs. I do want to add, both because I'm going to continue this discussion with a recommendation, but because I do know there are some that are not. So I don't have that perfect transparency. CAISO team does. I believe very strongly there are some projects in this table that do not have MMAs, and they may not have even started a portion of their phase. So with that context, those are the ones that I'm mostly focused on. And even if they have a portion of them come online, I believe that those projects still do count towards what I'm raising, because if we were saying they were going to do a phased commercial operations, right? And let's use this cluster 14, 320 megawatts. Let's assume it's a single project because I don't have the breakout in front of me. If a portion of it came online and now this is the remaining, is this really moving towards COD or not? And if it's not actually moving in commercial operations since the cluster 4 process, then it shouldn't be then the premise of this is how do we right size the queue so that we have them withdraw at the partial capacity because they're not moving towards commercial operation. And I think that's kind of what I want to tie this to is, are you moving towards commercial operation or not? And when do you know that information? And if your dates for moving to commercial operation shift, what is your obligation to make sure the CAISO knows that information? So while we don't have perfect information, you do. Can I go to the next slide, please? Super helpful conversation. Okay, so the concept that I really believe would add a lot of value to our queue management process would be a process to require valid milestones in all of the projects. If the milestones are not updated, so it's all right to keep updating your milestones as your timelines shift. You update them on a basis, and but if you don't and you fail to maintain accurate information, then you should be penalized. And if you fail to pay your penalties, that might necessitate the ability for the CAISO to determine which projects need to be forced withdrawn and/or terminated, whichever you want to use terminology. So the concept would be to require milestone updates for every project past its scheduled date. Otherwise, you can assess the penalty and potentially terminate. And in the case of an executed IA, you could terminate it for failure to maintain accurate, achievable milestones. Achievable schedule updates for all projects and all study processes, including alternative study options, which was a part of our previous proposal. I just want to clarify, this proposal it needs to affect every single project. It's not just a cluster proposal. It needs to affect every single type of project so that we can ensure that every project that is included in the cases that are going into the studies is as accurate as possible. It's also really important because if there's deliverability that's being retained on different projects, that they are incentivized to maintain the validity of their dates so that we have better certainty that deliverability is appropriately being held, moved to commercial operations, or released. I think that what is really open, and like this is the concept part, is this a deadline? Is it a rolling or scheduled process? Is it something where if you're 30 or 60 days outside of your milestones, do you need to update it, or is it something scheduled? The next slide will come and talk about pros and cons of that, and I'd like to hear some feedback and conversation. I would note that I think that the CAISO's concept too included an idea of a hard limit on the number of years in the queue. I've embedded that into this concept. I think that's a good idea, to limit the current online updates to no longer than 10 years. So part of what we talked about in prior meetings was just the difficulty around the commercially viable criteria and how there's so much subjectivity project to project. I think that if you were to allow for updates to be approved on a regular basis, and I am kind of envisioning this is a good example of something where we may not need an MMA to do it, but allow updates, let's say on a biannual basis. If that update request takes it beyond 10 years from the queue date, that would be consistent with the CAISO's idea of a hard date where the dates could not be further extended. If the interconnection customer fails to either, let's say it's a biannual process, you have to resubmit your achievable milestones. I would say that could be for every project, either confirming or updating those dates that would transfer into the CAISO's, all of our databases, and be able to impact the next study that's performed with the most accurate information. If an IC fails to meet that deadline, we are just starting with a conceptual proposal of a $1,500 per day penalty. Most BPM penalties that I'm familiar with are $500 a day. There's no magic in a $1,500, but it's the concept of having enough weight to ensure that you know that you have a milestone update requirement, and if you miss it, then you're going to be assessed penalties. If you fail to pay penalties and it reaches a certain level, which then this is another thing that we've discussed, is how does the CAISO know for projects that have executed IAs when it might be appropriate to try to terminate that interconnection agreement or not, right? Because of the subjectivity. Having a process where there is a deadline to update that, if it goes beyond 10 years from the date, the queue date, it's a firm denial, essentially, and that would trigger CAISO the ability to file at FERC to terminate that IA and withdraw it. If it fails to meet the requirements of updating the milestones and it pays a penalty and it exceeds a certain level, then that can inform an understanding by the CAISO that that project developer is not going to be meeting their requirements. And so that could be a sufficient basis to then terminate the interconnection agreement at FERC. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through this one real quick because this is mostly a conversation. I'm not sure how we're going to do this with it being virtual, but we're going to give it a shot. I think so the first question that I want to pose is, we use material modification assessments for changing the milestones in the interconnection request or even an executed IA. And I know we've been talking about, well, what are the types of MMAs that we might be able to right-size by moving away from the MMA process? So my first question is, is updating milestones the type of project change that could be supported by a process of just uploading let's say uploading a template with the new dates and making sure that RIMS accepts those dates rather than going through an MMA with a formal CAISO approval? So that's my first discussion question. So let me pause and see if there's any hands that folks would like to raise or CAISO staff that wants to jump in, and please share your thoughts on date changes. Do we need an MMA for that? Or is this one that we could consider maybe moving away from MMA?
This is Ryan Cox with the queue management team. I think one of the biggest issues we'd have with moving the COD changes away from the MMA is that we do need to study if these milestone changes are going to impact other projects. And that, I believe, needs to be studied at the time that the milestones are changing. And so that's just the first concern that jumps to my mind.
Can we look to see if there's any hands raised by stakeholders too while we're waiting to see if there's any feedback?
Yeah, we have a question from Rayanne.
Hi, thank you. Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting. Kathleen, I decided to speak up here because I have a complementary proposal in my deck, and if we can talk about it here, maybe we can save that time there.
Yeah.
First, I want to respond to Ryan and say that definitely projects should not be able to impact other projects. That is the definition of a material modification, and it's not acceptable. In my mind, the only way that a project extending its COD affect another network upgrades that are required, or holding on to needed capacity by, being a lingering project. I understand that the CAISO already requires projects extending their dates to pay for any network upgrades needed by others. So they can only really extend the timeline payments for network upgrades that are exclusive to them. And then the latter, sort of eliminating lingering things, that's an issue of enforcement, not really an issue of the MMA process. So I wanted to put that out there. In my proposal, Kathleen, I thought the framework should be that, as you execute your GIA, if your COD is out of date, then you need a new one before you execute. Then post-execution, you only get one request to modify the COD date after that. If there are PPA alignments or PTO delays, those come forward at no cost to the customer, but only one elective request to extend. And then beyond that, I think it could be efficient for the CAISO to require projects to update their COD dates at the end of the year in anticipation of study work that begins in January to make sure that anyone who has dates in the past or dates that are just no longer achievable, those dates get updated and then those studies start with an accurate base case. So I think I'll stop there and see if you have any reflections.
Yeah, I think this is very helpful. So I was wondering, let me see if you have feedback on this. End of the year makes a lot of sense to me, kind of consistent with some of the other milestones that are generally at the end of the year. I was wondering if there was a value in maybe like a let's say we go back to a normal cadence, right? So like like 2 times a year, one just before beginning phase 1 kind of studies versus one, so like let's say May, and then one in December before we go into the next year. Do you think that that is too much? Like, do you think that is needed, or do you think the once a year would be sufficient for the value? Really,
I think it's once a year, only because you know, in my work inside and outside of the CAISO, 6 months is not a long time. And I think you know, once you get sort of even that bulk study done where everybody who has a new date submits it to the CAISO and the CAISO looks at it all at once, right? That's still quite a bit of effort, and I think doing it twice a year would just be a little chaotic. Obviously, if there's need for, then that's what it is. Of course, if, you know, Deb thinks that the current sort of individual project management approach will be sufficient for keeping dates up to date, then such a process is not needed. But as I'll show with my slides later, my concern isn't actually the current queue, it's the upcoming queue and sort of the deluge of projects that we'll be seeing in 13 and 14 and 15, and how to get really efficient.
I just want to follow up and say that I really support what you just said. The big concern is the future queue. So I'm looking forward to your presentation. I don't want to take up too much time. If there's some others, is there anything else, Rayanne, or can we see if there's any other hands?
Nope, I will put down my hand.
Okay, thank you. Any other hands raised?
Yes, we have a hand from Susan.
That would be great.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I'm not sure if I should say this now or during the Gridwell presentation, but we would oppose, I'm sure, only one opportunity to extend the COD for a project, aside from a PTO delay or a PPA alignment. I think sometimes you want people, I think, to have aggressive deadlines to try and get their projects online, but sometimes things do come up. And it would be terrible if something came up that could be overcome, but then because you'd already delayed the project once, you have to lose the project. I mean, it just doesn't seem, that seems way too restrictive. So I'm sure that we would oppose that. So that's it. I think otherwise you're going to have people who are going to, if they only get one chance, you're going to delay it as long as you possibly can. But that's not the direction you want people to go. You want people to push aggressively to finish their projects. And so it may mean that they will delay them more than once, hopefully not, but you don't want them to just play it safe and have delays that maybe could have been overcome. So I just want to say that.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate that, Susan. And just to clarify that this, like the Vistra concept is more aligned with, I think, what you just described. We want there to be a regular, clear process for easily updating milestones. We think that it, you know, if we put some human experience around this conversation, and I really want to hear your feedback on this, but the human experience is things that are hard and confusing make it more difficult for folks to make sure they're doing the best practice. The easier we make it and the clearer we make it. So we define, you know, and we put it in the milestone tracker, 2 different deadlines. Let's make it one deadline, once a year, it's fine. December 1st, milestone updates for deadline. Just like everything else, we have deadlines in the queue. Everybody who's moving along in the interconnection gets that they have these dates. It's on the tracker, it's clear. There's a template made available. They can use that template, send it in. That will reduce so much friction in projects that may not be updating their milestones, and also make it okay, because I think that a part of what you alluded to that's really important is project timelines change a lot and often, can change a lot, can change often between conception of an interconnection all the way through to commercial operation. And so we don't want to imply, I believe, we don't want to imply that there's something wrong with those dates changing. Things change, right? We want to make it easy for the dates to be updated on a regular basis. And as long as they're updated and the CAISO and all the PTOs have the accurate information in a timely manner so that there's no adverse impact to the studies and to all the other planning efforts going on, I believe we've provided the flexibility projects need, we've mitigated any adverse outcome. But then the part of our thinking was, with that flexibility and that understanding, we're okay with agreeing on a year length that a request to extend just can't be approved anymore. We're very flexible on what that is, but we started with 10 years from the Q date. If you feel like it needs to be longer, very open to that and your feedback. But that, do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of what you're saying we don't have a problem with, but we did oppose the hard deadline. And because if a project is, really close and it's not, they're getting close to 10 years, but they have just a little bit more to do you want to lose the whole project that late in the process? I think you have viability criteria, and as long as the project meets the viability criteria, they've got a PPA in line with that, they've got, whatever it is that the viability criteria are out there, then the project should be allowed to continue. So no, we don't favor hard deadlines. Then you're gonna have a lot of finger pointing about whose fault it was that this amount got lost, or that that year got lost, or whatever it was. And we don't think that's productive. If a project demonstrates it's viable and it's moving forward, it should be allowed to stay in. It's the projects that can't demonstrate that should be out. So, so we're out for enforcement of the rules, but we don't think a hard deadline, there's any particular benefit to that, particularly if a project if a project comes in 10 years and 6 months and they've maintained their viability throughout, we're good with that.
I believe you've also recommended a different appeals kind of process where one-offs could be requested, and just to make a plug for that before I move to the next slide, I know it was in a different place, but maybe think about it.
Yeah, it was
in
completely
this
different,
context
actually.
as well.
No, we don't. I wouldn't say it at 9 years and 9 months you're going to have to plead for your project not to be tagged. No, that was to enter the interconnection queue. So whatever project, our proposal was whatever method is used to screen interconnection requests, whether it's locational or LSE interest, or there were different proposals out there, that there should be an appeals process where a project can come in and demonstrate additional value to the grid, additional reasons, technology-based reasons,
Susan,
potentially.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I only have enough time to get through my presentation, and all I was trying to encourage you to do was, if a hard deadline or a deadline is in our future, I would encourage you to think creatively as we try to come up with a compromise that will be in the best interest of everyone. Next slide, please. I can move back to this one, but I do want to get through this, and I know I'm running out of time, Danielle. So.
Okay, I just want you to characterize our proposal incorrectly, Kathleen. I'll put my hand down now. Thanks.
No, my apologies. I didn't mean to mischaracterize. I understand it's different. Didn't mean to mischaracterize. Thank you, Susan. I just wanted to also, and before I wrap up and see if there's any other comments on the concept, is that achievable schedule dates are important. We should be, all clusters and project types should be required to have achievable schedule updates through ideally a new submission process if we can get comfortable with it. Upload to RIMS directly, ideally doesn't require an MMA approval. Maybe there's exceptions, we need to work on that. Obviously, I understand that. Listing Appendix B, so there is definitely between phase 1 to phase 2 and Appendix B, when you submit it, requires your updates, your achievable schedule dates. We would say let's start with the same list, and if there are others, we can get the feedback from stakeholders in CAISO if there's other milestones that are particularly needed. Feedback from the PTOs would be helpful here. But I believe a template that requires this is similar to Appendix B can be provided and made available for a regular recurring update to these achievable milestones. And, you know, I'm very happy to have conversations. And like I pitched this in the beginning. The big point is that we need to have accurate, achievable dates for projects at a reasonable time period, and stale dates are not in the best interest of the queue. And we hope the CAISO, you know, takes this concept and this discussion and takes it. We just ask that you take it really seriously and try to think about a proposal or a solution that you think is in the best interest of the queue when you're thinking through your straw. Any other comments or questions? I'm happy to take.
Are there any other questions?
Kathleen, this is Jill Jordan with the CAISO. I just wanted to first thank you for your presentation and just let you know that the queue management team is aware, we are fully aware of the projects that are in the queue that have milestone dates in the past. And we are actively working with the interconnection customers, trying to get those dates updated. And we're making an effort going forward to be more proactive in requesting those milestone updates from the interconnection customers before those dates lapse. So I wanted to maybe provide a little bit of comfort there in regards to going forward. We're working on cleaning that up, and we are going to be working proactively with the interconnection customers going forward so that we can keep the milestone dates that are in the queue up to date and current.
Thank you so much, Jill. Do you mind if I ask you a follow-up question? When you say that, do you mean the cluster projects only, or do you mean all project types?
We are working with the projects that are listed in the queue that have the milestone dates that are in the past.
So like an independent study project that's listed in the queue?
Kathleen, all projects in the queue.
I was just curious. Okay, that's great. That's really helpful clarification. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and I will turn it back around.
Kathleen. All right, we're going to turn it over to SDG&E. So I think we have Keith Ban and Alan So on the line. So if we could promote them to panelist. All right, and I'll hand it over to Keith and Alan. Alan, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Alan. I think Keith Ban is going to be presenting this one today.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Alan. I will make the presentation, but if there's anything that you would like to add, Alan, please do so. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Keith Ban with San Diego Gas and Electric within the Transmission Planning Group. Just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to share SDG&E's proposal related to problem state number 2, managing the queue. I also wanted to note that this presentation will be focusing on the projects that went through the interconnection study phase. Not too many projects make it to this point, so we're just trying to propose a solution so that whatever the projects have moved on, they're moving along the process. And with that in mind, we feel that, next slide, please. We feel that the key component in trying to solve the problem state number 2 is to tighten what we call the commercial viability criteria requirements. We listed 4 items here, and the first one relates to site exclusivity. And by this, we don't mean deposit in lieu of site exclusivity, but the actual site exclusivity document that has the sufficient site control through the commercial operation date, which could involve like the necessary land or acreage. like for example, I think that about 5 acres is required to develop for each like 1 megawatt of solar system. And those are the kinds of things that we would be looking for here. And then the second item relating to obtaining necessary permits. We would also like to see that the projects are going through the permitting process with the appropriate government agencies. That shows us that the project is committed toward developing their project. And the third item here relating to the customer making the third financial security posting, this would also demonstrate that they're also financially committed toward developing their project. And we're also requiring that this posting be made within 1 to 1.5 years from the final study report and prior to entering into the GIA phase. Otherwise, the project will be deemed withdrawn. And the fourth item here, I think this one is a little bit more controversial, but I guess to the extent that the projects can show that there's been any potential interest from the off-takers, that would be beneficial as well. And we felt that given that we're discussing this requirement after the final interconnection study, we feel that this requirement is fairly reasonable. And I know that there's been a lot of the, moving on to the second item, I know that there's been a lot of discussions with Susan and Kathleen regarding the MMAs. So I'll just be very brief here. Foster more than a few times that there's a project that's undergoing, like I think 14th MMA request. And I think that what we're proposing here is to limit the MMA request to no more than once every 12 months. And also to make it into a fee-based process as opposed to like the 10,000 that we have currently, and to increase the amount as well, depending on the complexity of the MMA. I do understand that there's different types of MMA requests. So if we are able to tier based on the complexity, we would be open to that as well. Let's see, the next two items. We also talked about this as also the minimal withdrawal penalty for the older projects and higher withdrawal penalties for newer projects. And so we're proposing that for pre-QC12 projects, the ones without the LGIAs in place, we're proposing to have these projects withdrawn with minimal penalties. The reason why we're choosing for the pre-QC12 is because we feel that if they're pre-QC12, they had sufficient opportunity to park their projects, went through the TPD allocation process, and we're thinking that if they have not entered into the GIA phase at this time, then most likely there are like limited developing opportunities. So just trying to clear the interconnection queue, and it would benefit all the other projects if we made it easier for them to drop out of the queue. And for the newer projects, we're proposing to increase the withdrawal penalties for obvious reasons to try to prevent unviable projects from remaining in the queue. And finally, we're proposing to reduce the IR park timelines. I guess in hindsight, this is somewhat related to the third IFS posting requirements prior to negotiating the GIA, like making sure that this is done within 1 to 1.5 years. But at this time, I mean, even if they do make the postings, we feel that this requirement would just place additional criteria that would help mitigate or manage the interconnection queue. And this was a one-page presentation, and hopefully this wasn't too controversial, but this sort of concludes our presentation. And thank you very much for the opportunity once again.
Thanks, Keith. We do have a question from Susan Schneider in queue.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a couple of comments and I guess one or two questions. Requiring the third posting before the GIA. The GIA is a commitment for to build the project on the part of the PTO, the interconnection customer, but it's also a commitment on the part of the PTO to meet certain deadlines in order for that to happen. And I do think it will be definitely controversial to require people to put up 100% postings before they even have a commitment from the PTO, a contractual commitment to meet the deadlines that are needed for the project to be built. So I do think that will be an issue for sure. It's particularly because the GIA deadlines are now more flexible based on the longest upgrade. So, if it could be say 2 or 3 years before you sign a GIA, but somehow the project would have to put up all of the posting and make it non-refundable before anything's really been agreed to on the GIA. I do think that will be a bit of a problem. I did want to ask a clarifying question on your number 3. Can you talk about why you are talking about only projects that do not have executed GIAs?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Susan. Regarding your first 1 or 2 questions, for one, I think we're somewhat flexible whether the third posting reflects whether there would be 100% or whether it would be a modified percentage of, let's say, 50%, 66%, or 75%. So I think we're just trying to make sure that there's additional financial requirement being placed on the project to advance to the next GIA phase. And regarding the question about the commitment on the part of both the PTO and the IC regarding GIA, we feel that at that time all the studies have been completed, and we should have sufficient level of information to feel comfortable entering into the GIA. And the terms of the GIA itself may have some leeways here and there, but we feel that this is an important milestone with respect to whether the projects are proceeding or not. So that's one. And then I'm sorry, there was a question about like one-time opportunity to withdraw, like with the executed LGIAs. I think like similarly, if the projects have committed toward, or they are in the GIA phase, we're thinking that the terms of the GIA will dictate how those projects should be treated going forward. So we're only targeting the ones where the projects are lingering in the queue without an LGIA in place. I think those are the ones we want to make sure that they're either moving along or not.
Okay, but the CAISO rules don't require a GIA right away. They only gear the GIA deadlines to the longest upgrade versus the project COD or in service date. Are you proposing that would be changed? Is that that's why I'm just trying to understand the project with or without a GIA, in particularly where one might not yet be required.
Yeah, so I think that's we might be saying the same thing, but I think that's what we are proposing, that after the study phase has been completed, that the projects are in a situation where there's more certainty added to their intent. And one way is for them to either post within 1 to 1.5 years timeline. And I think we're somewhat flexible to that timeline as well. But we do feel that some type of timeline should be established. And given that that's one of the items that we're trying to address, we do feel that it's important to have criteria for what the projects, their intentions are. And we feel that tightening the CVC requirements as identified in number 1 is critical to solving what we're trying to solve here.
Okay, and are you proposing then that the shortlist, the power procurement shortlist or interest would have to happen before, what timeline, what would be the timeline for that?
Yes. So I think I did preface by saying that that might be a little bit controversial. So to the extent that, I mean, we listed 4 items here, but it's possible that maybe 3 out of 4 might suffice. But we do feel quite strongly that some of these items do need to be met.
Okay, so when do you
And
think that would be, we need to be met then, if that was part of the demonstration?
I guess I would go with the same timeline as the third posting, within 1 to 1.5 years. And we do feel that that's a reasonable time, given that by that time, the final study phase should have been completed like more than a year ago.
Okay. All right. I don't want to take any more time, but I will tell you. Okay. I've already said what I'm going to say about it, but thank you. I do think making a third posting with no contractual commitment on the other side will be an issue. And you may be effectively proposing then that the effect of this whole thing might be to have to bring the GIA execution much sooner, which is opposite to what the CAISO has just done recently, which is to make the GIA potential execution potentially later if there are long lead time upgrades. So somehow I think that you'd need to somehow coordinate those two things. So anyway, I'll stop talking now and let somebody else get in.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay, we have time for one more brief question before we need to move on, because we do have just about an hour left and 3 more presentations to get through. So let's take Kathleen's question and then we'll move on.
I'm Kevin Kohler from Vistra. I'll be brief. Maybe you can take one more. So thanks, Keith. I just wanted to re-emphasize something I think I've mentioned before, which is a third IFS posting out of the phase 2 study and before going into GIA negotiations. I have some comfort with that idea. I don't think it's not shifting the third up, but it would be a third, and then we would have a 4th posting, which would be what I think of as the third financial security posting as of today, on or before the start of construction. But this third one takes a chunk and puts some additional financial skin in the game in between phase 2 and the interconnection negotiation. Is that something that you're open to?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we do realize that there's a big jump from 30% to 100%. So I think anywhere in between would be something that we're open to discussing. But we did want to see some additional financial commitment prior to entering into the GIA phase.
That sounds good. I just wanted to give you Vistra's support that we think that that's reasonable, somewhere in between 30 and 100.
Yes, we agree. And thank you, Kathleen.
All right. Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Alan, for your presentation. We're going to go ahead and move on to Clearway's presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Sushant Barab. So if we could move Sushant to panelist, that would be great. And I will hand it over to you. And Sushant,
Go ahead and
yeah, you should be able to unmute your line.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about this issue. Last week, or in the last meeting, Clearway talked about changing rules around TPD allocation and retention, as well as the need to address interim deliverability early on in the process. Today, we just have one slide, and it's mainly focused on MMA and limited operation study. And this issue is significantly impacting a lot of advanced stage projects that are bringing critical capacity online in the near term. To give some context, Clearway owns and operates more than 2 gigawatt in California. Nationwide, we own and operate 9 gigawatt of assets. And over the next 6 to 8 months, we are bringing close to 900 megawatt online. And that makes us very sensitive to these topics of MMA timelines and limited operation studies and their outcomes. And we feel that as more and more projects go into that advanced stages over the next 5 years, which is going to be an exponential rise, this issue needs attention very urgently. Maybe one of the top issues that we want to address. It falls under the problem statement 2 of queue management. And I think there's another aspect which makes these issues very critical is very late stage upgrade delays that some of the projects are experiencing, and how that interplays with ability to get limited operation studies requested on time, get those done. And same goes for the MMAs. And we are completely aware that CAISO, queue management, planning engineers, PTO planning engineers are all doing what they can to help these projects within the rules that we have today. But today's rules don't seem to offer a whole lot of flexibility and relief for these projects. And so I want to strongly advocate for simplifying these rules so that all parties experience less pain as more and more projects get into this boat. So we think that today's process for assessing MMAs and validating MMAs put a significant strain on already scarce engineering resources that could be better used on performing studies or putting out more information that helps stakeholders. Taking an average of 86 days for an MMA, and that is without the data validation window, which we have seen to be more than 30 days in most cases. That is a significant amount of timeline when we see year around how many studies that CAISO is performing and how many resources they need to address interconnection process. So we are proposing ideas around a few facets. One is simplifying modeling requirements. I think few speakers have talked about it earlier. I want to highlight that there are some changes or modifications that don't require resubmittal and revalidation of all the models. And a couple of examples could be just extension of COD or requesting grid charging for any older BESS projects where they may not have requested those. I think a lot of requests where a developer confirms that there are no design changes, nothing has changed. Engineers don't really need to go through that entire process of validating the same models again and again. Second idea that we have is around facilitating a discussion between developers, PTO engineers, and CAISO engineers. We have experienced that a lot of times there are very minor deficiencies and cures, but the administrative process around it, where the engineers send comments in an Excel workbook, then they go to the developers respond, and everything takes at least a week, and that adds 2 to 3 weeks, even for very minor fixes in the models or in the documents. So I feel if within 15 days of an MMA submittal, we can have a call between all three parties, and by that time, if engineers have all the deficiencies and we just walk through all of those, and a lot of them could be resolved on the call itself. That's been our experience on some of the MMAs, where once we get on a call, things move very quickly. And then the third point I want to make is, I think in one of the earlier proposals, there was a discussion around not allowing MMAs and limited operation studies to move in parallel. We have had some examples where there were commercial milestones or financing milestones or contracting milestones that required both processes to move in parallel. And when we look at the success rate of MMAs, where 99% of MMAs get approved, we feel it's important to not create more interdependencies, especially during critical phases of financing and construction. I think developers should be allowed to take that risk of failure of an MMA, where if an MMA fails, then limited operation study is pretty much left meaningless. the project cannot move unless the MMA is valid anyways. So there's no adverse impact to any other project if the limited operation study cannot can proceed at the same time as an MMA. So we strongly feel that that interdependency should not be created. Lastly, I think I heard a few comments and proposals on limiting the timing and ability to submit MMAs. This could be problematic in the sense that a lot of times, I don't think developers enjoy submitting MMAs. A lot of times it's either financing or lending milestones require certain documents to match up. So having our final design aligned with the LGIA, or in absence of an LGIA, an MMA report. This applies to offtake contracts as well. So a lot of times those commercial drivers are forcing a lot of developers to submit MMAs at certain points, and sometimes they can be very close and very frequent. But I think there has to be an appreciation of the need for MMA sometimes comes from external forces that maintain commercial viability of a project. So that's another point I wanted to make. And yeah, with that, I think we can open it up for questions.
Okay, it looks like we have 2 hands raised, so let's go to Fernando Cornejo. Oh, just kidding. Let's go to Ryan Millard.
You okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
Awesome. Really, this is just a comment. I just wanted to say I appreciated Clearway's attempt to simplify the MMA process by also highlighting the need to distinguish the nature of the modification request. I've been struggling to justify proposals to limit the number of MMAs that can be made within a certain timeline without doing that first. So thanks for that. And I think I'm a bigger fan of building off of this than going straight to a process that would limit them for the same reasons you just stated. So really just thanks and appreciate your presentation.
Thanks.
Okay, now let's go to Fernando.
Thank you. Thank you. Fernando Cornejo with SCE. Just a comment here on the proposed solutions around the facilitate timely validation of data. That also presumes, at least it's been our experience, that in certain cases, it takes an extended or inordinate amount of time for the interconnection customer to cure deficiencies that have been identified in the MMA. So the timing of the 15-day window for that meeting would be contingent upon, obviously, certain things running as smooth as possible. And we know that the hiccups that will come around, but it would require, some degree, a strong degree of accurate information and data that has been cured before that meeting can take place. And so that's largely contingent upon getting that validation process completed after the IC has submitted valid data.
Yeah, thanks, Fernando. And maybe a clarification. So the meeting or validation call that we are proposing is before the validation happens. So we agree that a minimum level of standard has to be met when MMA application is submitted. It has to be complete for sure. But if there are technical deficiencies, instead of exchanging those through documents that 3 parties review and then we lose 3 weeks before anyone can respond, the first touch point could be a call where the engineers talk to engineers, and that in our experience has been a quick way of resolving a lot of these. If they're, to maybe nerd out on that, we have seen like decimal point discrepancies on dynamic data, which via emails, someone asks a question, someone responds after 2 days, we lose a week here and there. That could be done very quickly on a phone.
Yeah, well, that sounds good, but I just wanted to point that out that, as far as you can, this whole timeline and when you meet to actually discuss the MMA is very dependent upon the accuracy and the refreshed or clean version of that request based upon any notice of deficiencies coming back from the PTO's review. So just wanted to point that out. Thank
Understood.
you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
And yeah, I was being a little greedy, putting 15 days there. But I wanted to
Yeah.
see how, yeah, everyone responds. Yeah.
Well, you did a good job. It does stir a reaction. So
Okay, one more question from Kathleen.
Hi, Shan. Thanks so much for this presentation. I wanted to just confirm, like earlier when I was presenting, we had a little bit of back and forth about whether or not the COD extensions needed MMAs, and I really appreciated you flagging that here as well. I know we heard some from the cases I thought maybe that it did require it. Do you mind just unpacking a little bit more why you think that it is all right for us to simplify the MMA process for that type?
Yeah, so on COD, our proposal is that COD changes don't really require rigorous validation and submittal and validation of modeling, because if the developer confirms that there are no changes from the last model that went into studies, I do appreciate the reason why CAISO still needs to study it, because they need to make sure there is no adverse impact to later queued projects. So in some ways, they may have to still evaluate it. It just may not be as rigorous on the data submittal and validation front. So I think I'm halfway in aligned with what you were saying.
Okay, so in your mind, this proposal kind of differentiates like a MMA light from like a standard MMA study that would be needed.
Right. Or I mean, setting different requirements by type of modification that's requested. Where today, even if it is, I think Susan mentioned deliverability transfer, right? Even for that, I believe we do submit everything. And a lot of times it's the same project being submitted again, but takes up weeks to validate all the data.
Great, thank you. And on the maintaining the MMA and limited operation study and that discussion, I really appreciate the way you framed it on a process that would allow the developers to take on the risk of the MMA not being approved in order to get the LOS to be performed timely would be a very helpful improvement. I just wanted to support that as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
This is Jill Jordan with the California ISO. I just had a follow-up question on the first item. Are you referring to like post-COD changes for battery storage additions that are just changing the battery storage addition? I just want to make sure that I'm clear on what you're proposing. Like in that case, are you proposing just submitting the IR package just for the battery addition and not the portion that's already online?
No,
what does that look like?
Sure. Yeah. So post COD changes, I was referring only if a project does not have grid charging today and wants to add that. For battery addition, I understand. I think CAISO and PTOs will need to see the entire model of how an added battery will look and interface with the existing project. So that piece I am aligned that you would need to see the entire model.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then just regarding the IR validation, I understand your concern there as well. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that earlier this year, the CAISO added a link to the website for the internet-based resource tool that helps developers address their own modeling issues, and what our hope is that will cut down on the deficiencies in the initial IR package before it's even submitted to the ISO. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that also is available to assist in the decrease in the time that it's taking for these IR validations for MMA requests.
Yes, and yeah, definitely very much appreciate that. That has been a helpful tool added. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. So thank you, Sushan.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, if we could promote, oh, looks like Rianne is already ready to go. So I'm going to turn it over to Rianne from Gridwell.
Thank you so much. This is Rayanne Quadra from Gridwell, and I want to thank whoever at the CAISO put my slide deck in this position because I literally agree with everything Sushant said. Those are really good presentation and those are really good proposals. The proposals I have here today take some of those ideas further. Next slide, please, down to 40. As we talk about interconnection queue management, I think it's important to understand the magnitude of the problem so that we don't focus too many resources on solving a problem that's not as big as we might think it is. So I downloaded the queue on July 19th, and I excluded from my analysis anything cluster 12 and beyond because it can't be online yet, independent study and fast track processes because they're subject to special rules about their time in the queue when they can modify their COD dates. And then any COD date that was in the past, I rounded up to the current day so that the calculation, skewed closer to reality. And what I found was that for all of those projects, so that's serial through cluster 11 that are active in the queue, we only have 27 gigawatts and 143 projects total. And then it's reasonable for projects who have been in the queue for 4 to 8 years to still be under development. That falls under the CAISO's 10-year cap. And given how far out network upgrade building is for a lot of projects, 10 years is, a good number to start the analysis from. So eliminating those 4 to 8 year projects, we have 56 projects that are in the queue that have been in the queue from 9 years up to 24 years. I did hear Deb say earlier that some of those projects are online and phased, meaning that they're partially online and perhaps the rest will be online soon. And so to me, that means that these numbers are even smaller. Can you go to the next slide, please? So of those 56 projects from before that represent about 9 gigawatts are the projects that we collectively refer to as lingering in the queue. And of those 56 projects, 41 have executed GIAs, which means they have milestones that can be enforced. And of those 41 projects, 27 are energy only. And because I know that projects rarely enter the queue as energy only, I know that a lot of those projects have been stripped of their FCDS for not meeting viability criteria. So if we concern ourselves primarily with deliverability over interconnection capacity, we're now down to about 6,000 megawatts of capacity that we should be really concerned about. And yes, energy-only projects can harm future projects by triggering network upgrades and study reports, and they shouldn't be allowed to linger, but they are sort of a smaller part of this package. And so I want to then present that data sort of in comparison to our upcoming clusters. Cluster 14 and 15 collectively have 176 gigawatts. So we've got 6,000 megawatts of FCDS that's being held up by lingering projects here versus we're staring down, at a future where we have to figure out how to manage a queue with many, many more times that amount of capacity. Next slide, please. So when I think about managing the queue, there are 3 drivers. Incentivizing projects to withdraw. This is probably most effective for those 56 projects with executed GIAs and those 27 projects that are energy only. Addressing projects that then still remain in the queue without indication of intent to proceed to COD. That I think looks like reviewing a project's viability, and I have a proposal for that viability in the following slide. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, based on the magnitude of upcoming clusters, that 176 gigawatts, control for future projects lingering in the queue. That means seeing how the IPE 2021 measures soon to be in place affect the queue, seeing how the results of this IPE initiative and any control measures we put in place here work, and then ensuring expeditious GIA negotiation processes and MMA processes. Next slide. So viability criteria. I'm definitely open to revising or adding to this list, but in my mind, viability criteria sort of at the executed GIA or post-phase 2 study rate is negotiation of a GIA, third financial security posting, having provided written notice to proceed on network upgrades, having paid all PTO invoices up to that point for work, or paid bills as they materialized for scheduled payments in the GIA, whatever is applicable to that project. Submitting evidence of RFO participation, showing that you are out there marketing your project and seeking, that commercial framework in order to finance and come online. Submitting real evidence of site exclusivity. I think some of those legacy projects are still using deposit in lieu. And then considering if the facility has achieved commercial operation for a portion of the total megawatt. To me, these are not binary criteria so much as a qualitative review of how mature the project is. And perhaps to make it more objective, we could add a point system or a rubric. We could potentially incorporate Susan's proposal for there to be a, opportunity to consult with a CAISO and make a case for a project that doesn't submit this framework. But, when you've been in the project in the queue for 5 or 6 years, you haven't executed GIA, your project should be pretty mature. Next slide, please. So onto material modification assessments. The MMA process exists to ensure all parties' needs are met. So that's the PTO, the CAISO, and the developer. Interconnection customers want to be able to modify their projects to improve their marketability and meet the LSD objectives should those change. CAISO and the PTO want to ensure modifications are within tariff bounds, that they have current information on proposed projects for study base cases, and that they've met their compliance needs. So those are sort of the things that have to happen in a modification process. They're the things that we cannot skip. The current process harms queue management efforts. Extended review times allow projects to linger with unexecuted GIAs or with dates that are expired. I have clients who have had MMAs last 6 months to a year, and that's not necessarily anybody's fault, but the process is flawed. Long review times and perceived risk creates unnecessary financing and contracting uncertainties for developers, harming and prolonging everything. So what does that mean? If you are a developer and your financiers or your executive team sees that the CAISO might reject your proposal to change your contract, then they are going to make you get that proposal to change approved, get that MMA approved before you are allowed to move forward with other meaningful but not necessarily connected activities. Next slide. Okay, so here's where my proposal gets really radical. I think that we should reduce the MMA process dramatically. From 2017 to 2022, the CAISO has performed, about 428 MMAs, 405 of them were approved. Just from a pure project management standpoint, this is not a sustainable process because it's not catching enough problems. At where we're at, we can't afford this, and we're certainly not going to be able to afford this kind of value of labor ratio as we move into these much larger clusters. The new inverter validation and proposed reduced technical data requirements in IPE 2023 are not going to improve this process enough, but I definitely support them and think they will improve the process. And also, I think that not providing the inverter data until it's meaningful is important because a lot of times projects are submitting inverter data in their IRs, and the actual inverters they'll be coming online with have not yet been designed or manufactured. So there will absolutely be a change before COD. Next slide. So my proposal is to shift the paradigm to where modifications are presumed approved. Eliminate years in queue requirements. 7 or 10-year time caps don't drive a high quality outcome. And as we see network upgrades getting further and further out, we will see projects that are viable going beyond those timelines. And furthermore, we have 2 superclusters now who are basically losing a year of their time in queue because their cluster study took an extra year. And the CAISO queue already shows many projects beyond these thresholds, as you might remember from the first slide. So to me, if our data is showing that we have projects that are beyond that timeline, then maybe that wasn't the right procedure. My proposal, as we talked about earlier during Kathleen's deck, is that projects would only be eligible for 1 post-GIA COD change, but any number of PTO extensions and PPA alignment modifications. And the GIA milestones must be enforced. Next slide. Also, that we discussed during Kathleen's presentation, projects with stale dates must provide new dates before the close of each year to ensure study assumptions for next year's work are accurate. And then acknowledging that the CAISO needs inverter data in order to make sure that the grid is safe and reliable. The modification process would consider that all inverter changes are approved, and then collection of that detailed technical data is a milestone projects must meet, whether that occurs during the get out process or after the GIA executed, whatever directive the CAISO needs. Whenever we get to that level of operational study is when that information would be required to be presented. And then, of course, the CAISO and PTO would go through their same validation cycles for that data when it came in. Next slide. Fuel type changes are a little more complicated, and they would require the customer to engage with queue management and do the math, ensuring that everyone is on the same page regarding interconnection rights and deliverability allocation amounts. The amount of deliverability associated to a solar project, for example, is not the same as would be associated with a storage project. So we want to make sure that everyone understands how one might convert to the other. But this wouldn't be a technical review, should only take about a week to perform. And then we have the interconnection modification requests that are actually serious. These are the ones that are listed as complex in the CAISO zone data. These are the ones that potentially get denied or conditionally approved. So those 23 megawatts, the 23 requests within that 430 requests that weren't just approved. And those, those modification types still would require the MMA and justify the raise of the deposit to 30K. The 2022 MMA cost and data timing report supports that increase. And if you don't have to do an MMA for a lot of those other slam dunk requests, then it's not that big of a deal. Next slide. The CAISO has the enforcement mechanisms to deal with unexecuted GIAs. And so I think this is an enforcement item, maybe not a change item. Ensuring site exclusivity is still valid could also be done at this point instead of during the GIA execution. And then in terms of things that potentially stall negotiations, changing the modification process to allow projects with unexecuted GIAs to get that quick math PTO extension done to minimum timelines and then execute ensures that projects won't linger while they're waiting for their MMA to be approved. Same with inverter changes or even fuel type changes. If we can perform those changes without going through a 45, 60, 180-day modification process, the GIA doesn't get to linger that long from execution. And then those quick math updates also do not delay the posting of network upgrades needed by others, which is easy to identify in study results. I'm going to stop there and ask Danielle. Danielle, should we take comments now, or do you want me to move into reflections on work group 2? We talked about that a little on Friday, and I wanted to look to you for guidance at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Rayanne. I think we should take questions here to see how that goes. I know we have one more presentation at 3:40, so we might have time to go into that, but let's make sure we get through the questions and substance first.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to Susan.
Hi, Kathleen. Hey, I was on
Rayanne. Susan, this is Rayanne.
Yeah, sorry, whoops, sorry, wrong. I'm one behind apparently. I apologize. On your slide 43 with the viability criteria, I know in the current viability criteria have some a permitting milestone, and I wonder if we could just go back. Oh, there we go. Thank you. And I was wondering, I noticed you don't have that here, and I was wondering if that was intentional or if you were thinking that it wasn't
Not
needed.
intentional. When I drafted this slide, I went through all of the proposals that were in the first workshop of this IPE and pulled out what I think was, in a basic way, picking up everybody's points. There are a lot of nuances in people's proposals, and so that would have to all be, combed through in a more discrete way as we develop the actual policy. But I think conceptually, these are things that should be addressed and definitely open to more. I think permitting is a valid milestone, especially as it comes to public land.
Okay. And then on your slide, on slide 46, if we could go to that, you're referencing new inverter validation and proposed reduced. Are you referring to SCE's proposal to postpone the inverter validation until later in the process? Is that what you're meaning here? I just want to make sure I understand your reference.
Both. I think all three PTOs proposed eliminating some portions of the interconnection request attachment A, some of the more technical portions of that. I have to go back to listen to that first meeting or go back to look at that slide deck. But yes, there was a proposal in this IPE to reduce the requirements of the technical part of the IR. And then the inverter validation process is the new process, I think, that Jill answered earlier, and that was implemented about 6 months ago.
Oh, okay. So you're referring to the KISO's inverter, the validation process. I just wasn't sure.
It should have been 2 bullet points. I'm sorry. Both the KISO's process and the PTO proposals in this IPE will help, but I don't think they'll be enough.
Okay, thank you. And then on 47, I don't want to take any more time because I know we're getting late, but I do think, there's any number of PTO extensions. You can do the PPA thing, but we really would oppose just one post-CIA COD change if the project is otherwise viable and there's a valid reason for the change. And I do think you want people to be aggressive. So I'm not going to repeat that, any more of that.
Oh, I totally get that. And from an academic standpoint, I see the argument you're making. It's just hard for me to understand then, what sort of that final cap is, because I'm not sure it should be a cap on years in queue, given how long network upgrades are going to take for future projects. So,
well, for example, if a permit comes out late or something, something happens, or then a study comes up later, they find some Native American artifacts or things. I mean, there are things that happen that are valid reasons for a COD change because an unexpected thing comes up. And I don't think it should mean that the project is completely lost because they've already done their post-GIA validation, unless you want people to go out 7 years all the time just to make sure they don't lose it, or maybe longer. I don't know, but that's
risky. If you go out 7 years, you might not be able to get the acceleration you need for your PPA because network upgrade construction hasn't started.
So I don't think this is especially productive to limit it to one when the project might otherwise be valid, healthy, and able to proceed. So with what might be just a small change or something like that. I just, anyway, just
Yeah.
just a thought on this. So that's, I don't want to, again, I don't want to belabor that one.
Sure, and that's why I think, that viability criteria is important. And then, your
Right.
proposal to make an exception in the IR process could also be applied to this framework. I'm not committed to this being the only way it could be implemented, but I definitely wanted to introduce all these ideas for consideration.
Okay, well, that one in particular, I think will be objectionable, but anyway, like I said, I'm done. I don't want to repeat it.
Okay,
We
thanks,
got
Susan. No, it's a
thank you
good
so. Thank
conversation,
you.
and I'm glad you spoke up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's go to Kathleen.
Great. No, thank you so much. And thank you, Rand, for this presentation. Thank you for the data. Thank you for the thoughtfulness. I just first want to acknowledge that. It's very comforting to see, and it puts a lot of good context around this. So thank you for taking the time to do that. Can I unpack something I'm trying just to understand on slides 47 and 48? So the point so on 47, you say one post-GIA COD change, but then on 48, projects with stale dates must provide new dates before close of each year. I believe, but I'd like to clarify that you're separating out, and I was sloppy with mine, but you have phase 1, phase 2, so you have projects that are going through the study process, you have projects entering negotiations, you have projects that are then leaving negotiations to execute IAs and then post-IA. Can you help me track these two bullets and make sense of them onto where you're seeing them in the process? Because they seem conflicting, but I think it's because of the timeline.
I don't think so, and here's where I'm seeing it. If you are, a project, you haven't executed your GIA yet, you're going to have to do that true up, right, when you execute your GIA, or before. So there's no limit on what number of modifications you're going to do before you execute your GIA, but we assume that the CAISO's procedure will enforce the timely execution of a GIA. So that's why it's post-GIA. And so then year 1, post-GIA, you're working on your milestones. Year 2, you're working on your milestones. Your COD isn't out of date yet, but at some point it does become out of date, and then that, one opportunity to extend purposefully feeds into, and you only get one extension, and you have to make it in a timely manner. So you're not necessarily using your one COD change the first year of your GIA. Maybe you're using it the third year of your GIA. It totally depends on the milestones for your project.
And I think that makes sense. And just to kind of connect, so that's super helpful. In my thinking, what I'm trying to mitigate is that if you only have one, if we were to take what the vision I had was, okay, so if you're in 1 year post your GIA and you just confirm that your milestones are on target. 2 years passed, you confirm that you think you're on target. 3 years passed, you know that you're not going to be on target. And let's say you then request an update, you give the next achievable milestones. And then your 4 years passed, and maybe that pushed you out 2 years or 3 years, making numbers up. And then the next year, something else materializes and you need to update it again. What I worry about is that if we have a one-time update, that projects are incentivized not to update it in that third year if they think that they're multiple years away and there's still risk of uncertainty on the timelines between that year and its expected now achievable milestones, that it would just not update them. And that I just wanted to flag that and see if you had any response or reflections on that.
So honestly, my proposal is a little bit strict in that you have to update your COD that 1 year and at the base case sort of at the end of the year. And if you've already used your MMA and now you need to move forward again, I have to wonder how realistic that is that your project is viable. And so you look at that viability check And honestly, at that point, you, based on your proposal, you have projects that would be in a queue for like 12 years by then. That's well beyond any cap, right, that's being proposed. So, I think there's a concern there. There's still COD, or there's still construction sequencing. So, you've got that 6-month sort of wiggle room basically at the end if what you're dealing with is, I don't know, procurement delays or something like that for materials. But I
just sorry, one quick clarification. Our proposal was from the Q date on the interconnection request window. So if you assume 2 years within 10 years, it's an 8-year post to phase 2. I don't know, just to clarify.
The CAISO's rules are currently from interconnection request date, and the rules for cluster projects are 7 years and serial projects are 10 years. So actually 10 years doesn't apply to very many projects anymore. Most projects aren't supposed to be in the queue after 7 years. And that's sort of the thinking that got me to wondering, is a year cap the most qualitative approach we can have?
No, I appreciate that. And I'm not, and just to be clear, Vistra's not married to 10 years. We're hoping just to find a workable solution. I think a lot of what you've presented is workable, and we'll take it back and think about it. I think the clarification that the update is required annually, and if you're 1 year post your GIA, that's your last chance, is a helpful clarification on your proposal. So thanks, Ryan.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we are right at 3:40. Danielle, I'm going to turn to you. I know we have quite a few questions left. Do you want to move on to our last presentation?
I think if we can do the questions really quickly and then like in 2 minutes move to the next presenter, 2 to 5 minutes move to the next presenter, we should be good.
Okay, then let's go ahead and go to Jerry.
Hi, it's Jerry Melchard, Public Advocate Office. Just a quick question. Where was it back? 40, slide 40. So of those projects that you looked at, I guess 56, and then you said 41 had executed GIAs. How many of those 41 do you have any information about signed PPAs?
The CAISO doesn't collect that information, and to my knowledge, it's not public anymore. The CPUC used to publish a list of PPAs, and that hasn't been online to my knowledge for 5 or 6 years.
You think that's a deficiency?
Academically, in terms of how do we most efficiently get to these answers, maybe, but from a commercial standpoint and from a competition standpoint, it's probably necessary to have that kind of opaqueness so that projects can continue to compete in a fair environment.
So what do you define as success for a resource developer?
Commercial operation.
And how does commercial operation get achieved without a PPA? Unless it's energy only. Do you know of any instance where that could be?
There
Do you
are
know of any instance?
Yes, there are several projects online that have EO, but from a straight number standpoint, very few of them have. I don't know if that will always be the case.
Okay.
The value of projects based on the CPUC procurement needs is changing and can change in the future. So I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Dairush.
Okay, this is Dariush with Calvium.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Rand, did I hear you right that you said projects should have one opportunity to adjust the COD after and some conditions around that? Could you repeat that point, please?
Sure, we can go back to the slide, which is slide 47. First off, I want to say that all PPA alignment changes and all PTO extensions would be allowed, Dariush. And then secondly, yeah, that is what I said. I explained in response to Kathleen's question that, you know, it's intentionally designed to sort of lead into a compliance project that would trigger a COD change. I'm hearing from this community that that's not popular. And, you know, that's fine with me if it's not a part of the proposal that gets picked up. But I do want to challenge all of us to consider, if it's not one COD extension after GIA, should it be a 10-year time in QTAP? Should it be something else? Like, where is sort of the final straw? You know, and how can that be objective and fair to all customers?
I must say, as somebody who's been involved in many development projects, there are 100,000 reasons why COD needs to change. And not almost all of them. Now, of course, I'm talking about the projects that are going towards completion, and both on the developer side and the PTO side, people are working on developing, building bay positions, and the developer building, buying facilities and installing them. And then something happens and delay things. I'm assuming what you're talking about, having a single opportunity, would be limited to projects who have not done any of the started development activities, are not complying with COD, with the requirements of the GIA. Because how can you tell a project that may have to delay a COD one more time because some salamander was found or some issue?
Yes, I know, the desert chicken, right? The tortoise, great. I'm perfectly well aware of all of these things. You also have to tell your LSE that if you're a viable project, you know, and you have your contracting in place via LSE power purchase agreement or corporate power purchase agreement, you also have to get, you know, their buy-in at that stage of maturity that you can extend your COD. And if they agree to it, then you come right back around and say, my COD has changed in my PPA, please align them.
Well, I don't buy that, because as I see it, Rand, if your LSC doesn't agree to it, now you have spent tens of millions of dollars on your project. PTO has spent tens of millions of dollars in doing the upgrades. You find another way of maybe buying and finding another LSC or operating merchant for a while until you find things. As far as the project proves its viability and meets the requirements of GIA, and you set a list of requirements which all point out to the project going towards development, going towards completion. This I cannot digest. That this.
Thanks, Dariush. I hear you, and I can tell that this is not a popular part of the proposal. I am not married to it. I'm getting word from Isabella that we need to move on, and so we're going to do that. I just want to make a plug for everybody that I did also provide reflections on the Working Group 2 proposals at the end of this deck, and I hope you'll check it out.
All right, thank you, Rayanne. And Dariush, maybe if you want to take that offline with Rayanne, I'd encourage you to do so. Okay, we're going to move into our last presentation for the day from Rev Renewables. So if we could move Renee Steichen and Abhishek Singh to panelists, that would be great. And I'm going to turn it over to Renee and Abhishek.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right. Renee Steichen from Rev Renewables. Thanks, Kaiso, for allowing us to do a last-minute addition here, and thanks to all the other presenters this week and the other week. There's been a lot of great ideas, so hopefully this is just adding a little bit on top of that. And the first one is actually, we're reviving it from the 2021 IPA initiative, and the second one, we see as very complementary to the others. So I'm going to turn it over to Abhishek, if you can go to the next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. So, like Renee said, great discussions so far, very helpful. What we are presenting today is a very nuanced issue, at least in our opinion. This was something that was brought forth in last interconnection process enhancement as well. And now we think since there is these discussions going on, we thought it aligned quite well with the queue management process. So our understanding right now is that Kaiso at this time does not track NTP status for the projects, and we are operating in post-LGIA world. We think that Kaiso should start tracking these NTPs for these projects. And in our minds, it serves twofold purposes. One of the first ones, which is related to queue management, is that it will help projects being more accountable for moving along in the interconnection process. And secondly, it should also help with shared network upgrades getting built in time for these projects. And again, once these shared network upgrades get built, usually that results in successful commercial outcomes for the project, kind of creates incentive for projects to come online as soon as possible rather than lingering in the queue. Let me give a little background for these network upgrades itself. In our experience for specific scenarios, where we have seen the delay in shared network upgrades, it's because of PTO expectation to have a certain number of projects at an advanced development stage. And this, it makes sense because PTOs are trying to limit their commercial exposure. But what we are thinking is that if Kaiso somehow starts tracking these advanced development milestones, such as NTP, again, operating in the post-LGIA world, it should help projects move along, right? I mean, once there is this accountability for both Kaiso, PTOs, and developers to provide these milestones on a regular basis to Kaiso, we believe it should help projects move along. And again, once the network upgrades get built, there is a PPA, there is commercial drivers that are wanting the project to come online at a certain stage. We believe this should work out quite well in moving the projects along. And again, last bit, it's not part of discussion today, but we believe that it should help with a separate but related transmission initiative, which is called Transmission Development Forum. And based on our experience, most of the times there is a lot of upgrades, especially on the generation interconnection side. There is specific project-related questions that get asked in this forum. And if Kaiso is closely working on tracking these milestones for these network upgrades with both PTOs and developers, I believe it will help cut down on some of those project-specific questions and also ensure accountability for these network upgrades to get built, again, creating more commercial reasons for the project to come online and not linger in the queue. So it was very high level. I know my presentation kind of goes deep into some of the mechanisms where, we are trying to limit the commercial exposure angle for PTOs, what can be done. I'm not going to get into the details because it was all covered as part of original life, but on a high level, this is what our thinking was. So I'll take a pause here, see if there's any questions, and then I'll let Renee cover the next slide.
Are there any questions for Abhishek? Okay, I'm not seeing any at this time. Oh, we have a hand from Susan.
Oh, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I guess my question here is whether would the customer be required to make a posting that exceeded its maximum cost responsibility or maximum cost exposure?
That is not part of our proposal, Suzanne. All we are trying to say is there are these NTP, it comes from LGIA Appendix B schedule, and all we are saying is, can CAISO start enforcing that so that projects actually meet those timelines and, move forward in the process?
I guess my question is on your second sub-bullet there, where it says, if needed, the PTO could require the first project to post security for the entire network upgrades and not just the cost allocated to the project. So they would have, I guess, so first of all, it sounds like could exceed their maximum cost responsibility. Second, would some of it, what would happen if other projects drop out or don't? I mean, I'm wondering about the logistics of how this would work.
Yeah, no, I think, okay, so now I see your question. So yeah, I think that could happen. We did not assume, projects dropping out in the queue scenario. What could happen is, since we have already paid for the upgrade upfront, and we could be, the cost could be distributed amongst the remaining projects, and, we would just pay our share of, in that scenario. Right, and then be reimbursed for whatever additional we have paid based on projects dropping out and kind of getting allocated to the remaining network upgrades in the process. So
would projects have to post security from? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand, because I know we're running late here. But would they would have to post more than presumably their maximum cost responsibility, and then if they would drop out, would they be liable for more than that? I guess I don't want to get too much into the details. I'm assuming this would have to you'd probably have to take this a little bit further to try and figure out just the implications of doing this. That's all I'm saying. So.
Yeah, no, I think I think it's a concept. Again, the goal is for projects to incentivize to come online, and there could be these scenarios we will have to work on a case-to-case basis. But the intent is, whichever project is trying to come online first, there should be incentives for letting projects do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Abhishek.
Okay. Our next one is on transmission plan deliverability allocation. This is more from the last workshop, and this is meant to be complementary to the other proposals that were put forward, not necessarily replace. I think it can work hand in hand with the Vistra proposal, for example. So I think, as Susan has pointed out in her presentations as well, option B is kind of broken process. Nobody chooses that process. So trying to think of a way to make it a more viable option to self-fund the project. Because I think early on in the interconnection process, after phase 1 results, you're going to try to go for option A and go through the TPD and get your allocation that way. So our proposal is very simply, if you go through the TPD allocation in your first year because you had chosen option A, so in your first year, you do not get any allocation, then you are allowed this one-time opportunity to go back and choose option B to self-fund that upgrade. And this is instead of, the current process where you just have to wait and park and then try again the next year, and then you're, could potentially just not get it if you can't get it the second time with the new rules. And so this would allow you more assurance in that process where you can get your deliverability. Well, I guess it has to go with that sub-bullet under there as well, where there is some sort of guaranteed deliverability. I hesitate to say that because we think we're even debating this internally, so I understand there might be questions on this. But thinking that you probably will still need to go through the TPD allocation process, but there would be a new group A in that allocation process. I think Vistra had that proposal as well. So in this new group A, the projects that chose to self-fund the upgrade would be given top priority in the allocation process. And then this is also kind of assuming that there is a limited number of upgrades, you know, one upgrade, let's say, and not that this project needs like 5 upgrades. And so in that case, it would still be very unlikely that the project would want to self-fund those 5 upgrades. But if there's one relatively small upgrade, then that could be viable. An additional variation of this could be that there's a process to allow generators to kind of pool their resources to collectively self-fund and share costs. So this could be through the Vista proposal for the subscriber network upgrades, or it could be in a more limited way, you know, where there's a relatively limited upgrade or dollar amount. You know, we kind of threw out numbers here like $30 to $50 million, and the construction timelines could satisfy procurement timelines, or, you know, something along those lines if we wanted to limit the process. But there could be some sort of open season on pooling those upgrades together to self-fund. It's going to the last section here on upgrade cost allocation and reimbursement. You know, if these are network upgrades, you know, we understand because they will benefit the entire grid, that reimbursement is desired. But so this part is not fully fleshed out either. You know, you could just say either, you know, you chose option B, and so you're going to self-fund that upgrade and you eat the cost, and that is now kind of a cost of your project. So I guess it will get paid back in terms of your PPA or however else you're financing your project, or allow some way, you know, through CRRs or some other reimbursement mechanism to get that funded. But if we think about this as something relatively small, where there's only 1 or 2 ADNUs that are relatively inexpensive, this could be a way to get some of those projects over the hump and through the queue. And that's it. Any questions on that?
Do we have any questions for Renee? All right, I am not seeing any. Thanks, Renee. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle to take us through some next steps.
All right. Thanks, Isabella. Well, thanks everyone for all these proposals today. I'm sorry it was tight timing and not too much time for extended discussion back and forth on all of these, but we really are grateful for your time. Just want to go through quick next steps, recognizing that we're over 4 o'clock. We are planning to have a final working group session next Tuesday, August 1st. The agenda is TBD, but the plan, like I said at the outset of this call, is to synthesize some of the proposals and concepts that we've discussed to date. And the ISO is working to give you all feedback and direction that we are planning to move forward with in the straw proposal. With that in mind, I know there are concerns around the comment deadline. I do want to impress upon you that we are in a compressed time period for straw proposal development as well. And so we are considering today or tomorrow, however you want to look at it, the beginning of the comment period. And we are taking these proposals back and starting to frame out what the straw proposal will look like. So the sooner we can get written comments from all of you on, you know, your observations from this working group process, the sooner we can incorporate those into the straw proposal, which we are hoping to post in the first couple weeks of September. So we are, you know, sensitive to your workloads and everything, but we also think your comments will be more valuable the earlier they come in. So we can get back to you on an actual firm date for the comment deadline. Right now, we have it set as August 7th. We do encourage you to try to get the comments in within the next 2 weeks, just so that we can incorporate that, but understand that there are challenges. And we hope that you can use the feedback that we all discuss on the 1st as an opportunity to inform the straw proposal as well. That's certainly how we're looking at it. We're not writing anything in stone before the 1st or before the comment period closes, but we are, you know, really starting to formulate what the proposal is going to look like. With that schedule in mind, we've slightly adjusted the schedule to try to move this to the Board of Governors for approval in February of 2024. That is even a pretty compressed time frame for us at this point, so that's why we're kind of driving forward on this pace. Any questions there? Okay. And with that, I am going to turn it to Joanne Serena just to make a few parting comments.
Great. Thanks, Danielle. I just wanted to say to all the stakeholders, really great job on putting together a whole variety of proposals. I think it's really great to see the level of collaboration between stakeholders on the different proposals, and we'll look forward to where we land in terms of a straw proposal, which we are getting close to assembling. So thanks for everybody's participation and engagement in this important initiative. And then with that, I think, Isabella, I think you have some things to actually close us out for housekeeping. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. So just some additional information on this slide. There's a link out to the initiative webpage, and then also the ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com email. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us there. Again, the presentations that we went over today are available out on the initiative webpage that's linked here. And the comment template that Danielle was just speaking about is available out on the initiative page now. So you will be able to access it anytime now through the 7th. And then just a reminder to check out the Energy Matters blog if you haven't already. One of the recent articles that we published was one on working with stakeholders to find the right improvements on interconnections. So that is what we are all here doing today. So if you haven't checked out the Energy Matters blog, I encourage you to do so. But that wraps up today's working group. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you to our stakeholders who presented today. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.